Thanks again for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Through Alumni Exchange, each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs, topics, and ideas so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, staff, and faculty experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon featuring two UIC faculty experts. First, Associate Professor of Social Foundations of Education, Dr. Nicole Wynn, who is joined by UIC Professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law and Justice, Dr. David Stovall, for this interactive discussion as they talk about how policing happens in schools and what a police-free school environment could look like. Thank you both for being with us here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wynn to begin the program.
Thanks so much, Karen, for that introduction, and to the UIC Alumni Exchange for organizing this talk. So I'm just going to dive right into it. So over the summer, we heard these resounding and renewed calls to defund the police and fund communities. Black Lives Matter, for example, issued a call to defund the police and invest in communities and resources to ensure Black people not only survive, but thrive. And this, of course, also draws from the Movement for Black Lives Divest, Invest framework focused on divesting from police and investing in communities, as well as historic struggles like the 1960s Black Freedom Movement, where the Black Panthers and other organizations saw public safety as something communities could do for themselves and through investments in things like the free breakfast program. And a lot of the conversations today around defunding the police and funding communities has focused on reinvesting in mental health care, social work, education, and other social services. Yet, these two are often carceral sites that control, contain, and enclose Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Teachers, for example, can push children out of school and into the criminal legal system, and schools can take on prison-like conditions and serve as prep schools for prison, having metal detectors, hall sweeps, patrolling officers, punitive discipline, communication with ICE and other immigration officials, curriculum that reinforces the logics of the prison regime, and so on. And my thinking here draws on the work of Dylan Rodriguez and Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, who talk about the need to think of the prison regime beyond just the physical site of the prison and the individual police officer. We have to think about all of the institutions, the sites, the practices, logics, norms, and actors who contribute to expand and normalize the prison regime, including schools, teachers, social workers, and so on. For example, historically, there were child removal policies in Indigenous boarding schools used to separate Indigenous children from their families by social workers as a key tactic of settler colonialism. We've seen psychologists who have conducted torture in Black sites across the globe, and psychologists who have trained police officers in torture, like John Burge, who uses torture in sites like Vietnam, Guantanamo, and Chicago. So all of this is to say that when we talk about abolition, we're also talking about undoing the carceral logics and practices that unfold in what we see as caregiving and life-affirming institutions like schools, social work, and mental health. And Ruth Wilson-Gilmore describes abolition as presence, not absence. So it's not just about removing or getting rid of the police, it's also investing in life-affirming institutions that support and sustain healthy communities and families, crowding out the need for law enforcement and transforming society into one that's less violent. In other words, abolition is a world-making project. It's not just about getting rid of the police. So part of what I want to do today is complicate the calls to defund the police and fund communities by thinking through how the provision of care, like mental health care and education, can actually further criminalize children, even in the absence of the police, and therefore often function as these carceral sites, as sites that expand policing in prisons. And then Dave's going to talk about what abolition might look like in schools if we think about how schools take on these policing functions, even without the police. So before we get started, I just wanted to offer this concept, this term that I use. It's called carceral care work. And I use the term carceral care work to think through how life-affirming and caregiving institutions like schools can expand carceral power, can expand policing in prisons. So that I use the term carceral care work to call attention to how the United States uses the provision of social services, uses schools, uses mental health to expand the criminalization of communities of color, while also appearing to rein in past practices of governmental overreach, racial profiling, and coercive policing. So carceral care work is trying to think about what's the relationship between care work and policing in prisons. And to kind of walk through this idea of carceral care work, I'm just going to give us one case study to think about how certain alternatives or perceived alternatives to coercive policing can actually intensify the criminalization of children in and through schools, through soccer leagues, social work, mental health, and so on, largely without the police, and instead by teachers, social workers, psychologists, coaches, religious leaders who take on these functions of the police. So, the purpose of this exploration is that if we want to defund the police and fund life-affirming institutions, we have to ensure that these life-affirming institutions don't also function the same way the police and prisons function. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick overview of one example. And so some of you may have heard of countering violent extremism before. So in 2015, President Obama convened this global summit where he introduced this new community policing initiative called Countering Violent Extremism. Sorry. So increasingly concerned about homegrown terrorists, the Obama administration promoted CVE as a new national security strategy to deter young people from joining violent extremist groups like ISIS, as well as Black political groups, often coded as Black identity extremists, indigenous water protectors, also seen as jihadists or terrorists, and others, essentially cast as potentially violent or dangerous. So Obama argued that this approach would actually serve as an alternative to the Bush administration's aggressive policing of Muslim communities by mobilizing teachers, mental health professionals, and other social service providers to the making of national security. So in this public safety model, community members like teachers take on the functions of the police by identifying, reporting, and working with students they perceive to be at risk of, or in the process of radicalizing, or on the verge of committing an act of violence. In Minneapolis, for example, an athletic center gave Somali youth free passes to use their facilities, right? To join sports leagues, a soccer league, to play basketball. And they also gave those young people guest passes so they could invite their friends to play soccer with them. But the intention here was to develop a social network map so they can map who all of the Somali young people were connected to as a counterterrorism tool. So this is about actually gathering intelligence by giving kids access to youth soccer leagues, right? And this was done on the premise that Somali youth are more vulnerable to becoming violent than the general public. And so we need to devise strategies to gather intelligence on young people, and youth soccer leagues was one way that they tried to do that by giving out these free guest passes. So through these guest passes, local officials reported that they knew who each Somali kid's friends were. They collected quote unquote good data, including progress in school, how often they visited the center, and which friends they brought with them. So the athletic center provided its typical social services like a soccer league, while also developing practices to gather good data or good intelligence that's useful to law enforcement agencies. So we can see how a simple soccer league turns into a site for surveillance, a site for monitoring, a site for intelligence gathering. So this approach to preventing violence has mobilized community members like soccer coaches, teachers, and social workers as co-producers of public safety. So using their daily contacts with young people to gather intelligence and communicate with law enforcement. And the FBI and other law enforcement agencies made this a clear practice, a central tactic that they used. And they warned that they needed to target high school students because high school students are seen as ideal targets for terrorist recruiters. And so that high schools, in their view, had to remain vigilant to this problem of terrorism. And so the FBI specifically called on teachers, guidance counselors, and other social service providers to, in their words, observe and assess concerning behaviors in communities indicative of students embracing extremist ideologies and progressing on a trajectory towards violence. So the FBI has called on teachers to monitor their classrooms for children who might be future terrorists or other violent actors. And the guidances on how to identify future terrorists is not rooted in any social science, and usually uses a child's political views, race, and religion as a proxy for dangerousness. And these are some of the indicators that different law enforcement agencies use, such as reading religious scripture, increased activity in a pro-Muslim social group, so like a Muslim student association on campus, concerns about anti-Muslim discrimination, frequent attendance at a mosque, and interest in adventure and action. These are all common childhood experiences, especially if you're a religiously or politically active child or young person. So this means that law enforcement agencies have collaborated with so-called trusted adults like teachers and guidance counselors who use their daily interactions with their clients to identify potential violent actors and then provide interventions that quote unquote off-ramp individuals from this perceived pathway to violence. In Minneapolis, for example, the public school system announced plans to hire youth intervention workers who would monitor the cafeteria and other non-classroom settings to, quote, help spot identity issues and disaffection believed to be the root causes of radicalization among Somali youth. And of course, like every kid in high school feels disaffected, but when Somali youth are disaffected, it's seen as a potential sign that they're going to be violent in the future. And we need these youth workers to report them to law enforcement. So here we see how folks who are tasked with providing support and care for children are actually taking on the functions of the police. So when we say defund the police and fund social services, we need to be sure that these social services aren't actually creating more harm and violence in the process, especially when they're used to expand policing in prisons, and also on the premise that some communities, right, Black, Muslim, and other communities of color are more susceptible to violence than other communities. And, you know, as I mentioned, most of the warning signs and risk factors of future violence are either explicitly racialized, such as wearing traditional Islamic clothing, or are so vague that they only arouse suspicion when exhibited by people of color, such as feelings of hopelessness. In fact, one Black Muslim organizer said, quote, when we say that we're trying to identify who is susceptible to violence before they commit anything, who is it that's deciding who those people are that are susceptible? Is it the same police who decides to shoot Black people who are selling a cigarette, or a young Black child who has a toy gun in a park? Because if you're working with those same institutions, I don't trust that they are able to identify who is susceptible to violence. So although we all want to reduce violence, empowering community members in this way, deputizing community members as the police, can intensify racialized policing evidenced in the vigilante policing of Black people, such as Barbecue Becky, the white woman who called the police reporting that she was, quote unquote, really scared of a Black family barbecuing in California. Hermit Patty, a white woman who called the police on an 8-year-old Black girl selling water without a permit. One veteran 911 dispatcher even reported that she fielded calls from white women, quote, upset over what Black people were doing every day. So when innocuous behaviors like barbecuing are interpreted and reported as suspicious activity, we must question whether mobilizing community members like teachers to identify these so-called concerning behaviors to prevent targeted violence merely intensifies such racial profiling and assumes the general public can objectively and evenly apply their suspicions. So despite these issues, police departments, social service providers, and community leaders are cash strapped, and many adopt these programs because it's a way to essentially gain access to new resources. So the Denver Police Department, for example, argued that, quote, terrorist groups target isolated and alienated youth for recruitment, leading to a partnership with Goodwill Industries to counter this recruitment tactic by preventing the initial isolation. So it used its relationship, the police department used its relationship with Goodwill Industries to conduct refugee and immigrant outreach, offered mentoring services to disenfranchised youth, quote unquote, not well integrated into their communities, and engaged faith communities, Black Lives Matter, diverse communities, refugee communities, and LGBTQ communities, among others facing disenfranchisement by society. So we see here the direct targeting of children of color and other non-dominant communities as more susceptible to engaging in violence than other groups. And this is ironic because it's happening in Denver and Colorado, where mass acts of violence have been committed by white upper middle class men, right? And so this is, the calculus here is clearly racialized, right? You're directly targeting Black Lives Matter as a terrorist group, and then you're tasking care workers to report them to the police. And we see this again in Maryland, where school staff identified and reported to law enforcement Muslim and Arab students experiencing quote unquote homesickness, acculturation-related stress, and economic stressors on the premise that these are signs that someone might be at risk of violent extremism. So we see how applying this national security, public safety lens to their communities, that teachers, social workers, mental health professionals, and other trusted adults have come to interpret common immigrant experiences as signs of terrorist radicalization, as signs of future violence, requiring interventions facilitated by these new community police partnerships. So for me, this is a kind of carceral care work in that we see the use of racialized policing in and through the transformation of ordinary places like school lunchrooms and therapist offices into sites of surveillance, and also turning social service providers into proxy national security agents. So after decades of downsizing social welfare while upsizing coercive and aggressive policing, the United States has reinvested in some disinvested communities by transforming the public provision of social supports like mental health care into a global war on terror weapon. And this fortifies already existing carceral practices in schools that are carried out by the police and school staff alike, such as punitive discipline policies, exclusionary punishments like suspensions, curriculum that reinforces anti-Blackness and the logic of prison, cooperation with ICE, and so on. So we can think here of an Arizona statute, for example, that mandates that social workers report any violation of federal immigration law by an applicant for public benefits like college scholarships, and imposes criminal misdemeanor charges on social workers who fail to comply with this reporting mandate. And these tips by social workers have facilitated immigration raids, making undocumented families afraid to pick up their kids from school, to go shopping, and to otherwise go about their daily lives. We can also think of the sort of 90s era California legislation, Proposition 187, which sought to bar undocumented people from accessing welfare benefits, non-emergency health services, and public education. And to make this happen, the measure required educational, public health, and social service administrators to check on the immigration or citizenship status of the people they serve. Right, so school officials were checking the immigration status of their students. Social workers were checking the immigration status of their clients. And the names of all those they suspected to be undocumented were sent to the Federal Immigration Service and to the California Attorney General. And this was done on the premise that undocumented children not only exploit taxpayer resources, they also are responsible for violent crime in neighborhoods. And so we can hear the echoes of President Trump's quip that immigrants are drug dealers, criminals, and rapists, right? this was not an exceptional moment under the Trump administration, right? There's a long history of this in the United States. So, when we say that we are defunding the police and funding schools, what does that actually mean if schools often function as carceral sites that control, contain, and dehumanize children? What does it mean when life-affirming institutions take on these carceral functions when teachers are tasked with, for example, identifying, reporting potential threats? So what does abolition in schools look like? So that's the question that I turn over to Dave.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Nguyen, in terms of allowing us to experience this in a particular way. I want to thank everybody for coming through today. I also want to thank you and acknowledge you for surviving the 3 pandemics of white supremacy, capitalism, and COVID-19. So when we are in these spaces, it becomes important for us to not only recognize what it is that we're in the current moment, but all the things that have amassed to get us to this current moment. So when Dr. Nguyen talks about this necessity of thinking about what defunding law enforcement, or shall we say carceral bodies, and now using those funds to now go into life-affirming bodies, now asking this question, which I think is an important question as to what does this look like? So when we talk about abolition, it's not just this far-fetched, theoric thing. Abolition is literally saying, we know something is happening. Now we have to do a couple of things. We have to end the practices that admonish, marginalize, and criminalize, but we also have to be willing to build something new. So a lot of times you may hear from folks that reform is not enough, right? We've had a bunch of reform over the years. Charles Payne has written an important book called So Much Reform, So Little Change, that challenges this notion around this reforming of this thing, and this thing now that we're speaking to in terms of schooling has never really worked for those who have historically been marginalized. So you can get a couple of cracks in the concrete in terms of getting some things through. But the larger question that we always need to be asking is, what does this mean for those who have been perpetually excluded? And here in Chicago, it's important because we have these sites that have been perpetually excluded, and they're deeply connected to this particular COVID moment. So the COVID moment allowed folks to see what health disparities, what food insecurity, what housing insecurity looks like for many people who were experiencing these things pre-COVID. So now those things have intensified. You put that together with a moment of racial reckoning where larger populations, largely white, see what has been happening in the United States in real time when someone actually gets murdered on camera. When we talk about George Floyd, or when we talk about Breonna Taylor, when law enforcement filed a false search warrant to actually enter Ms. Taylor's house. So now when we think about this in terms of schools and what Dr. Nguyen had put forward in thinking about CVE and now asking these larger questions of law enforcement, abolition pushes us in a different direction. And abolition put forth these questions around who is considered dangerous and who is considered a threat. And what are they threatening to do, right? So this is a larger ideological question that we often think about in terms of this war on terror. But remember, anyone who is standing in opposition or to a system who is challenging that system has often shifted into the threat. When Dr. Nguyen mentioned the Black Panther Party, remember, J. Edgar Hoover called the Black Panther Party the largest domestic threat to the way of life in the United States, right? So now, and the largest program of the Black Panther Party were health clinics and free breakfast programs, these life-sustaining entities. So now we have to ask the question, why are those things that are touching those people who have been the most dispossessed considered threatening? And this is a question that in many cases, law enforcement does not address, right? And it's important to Dr. Nguyen's point. Law enforcement's its construction is to respond to particular things. It's not meant to be proactive. So all of these kind of proactive spaces are null and void when they talk about building relationships with young folks. It's all under false premise, because police departments were never considered to be ones that would address issues of isolation and marginalization. Police departments were constructed to be at the service of the wealthy. So now when we start to think about this in real time, what does this mean in school? And let me say this about abolition. Abolition is not the end. Abolition is actually the beginning. So if we know something is not working, what are we willing to do? And now, based on what it is that we're willing to do we now use those practices to build something different? And I think a lot of times when people are grappling with terms like abolition, with terms like defunding, we need to go in deeper to these spaces, because what it's challenging us to do is to come to grips with the fact that some of these things that are purported to work for those who have been historically marginalized not only do not work, but have never worked. So now, what does it mean to engage in a practice that pulls from what people are already doing that works for young folks? And these things are not far-fetched. A lot of times when we talk about thinking about our world constructively, a lot of our solutions are right in front of our face. The broader question becomes, who is willing to engage those things? And is that thing, or does that thing have the greatest potential to disrupt the current orthodoxy that's keeping people marginalized and isolated? And this is a perennial question of the United States. So again, what myself and Dr. Nguyen are talking about today is not just this new thing. It's connected to a broader question that we've always been asking, and a tough question, because when we look at the history of US schooling, we see something else. US schools were really never intentioned to educate the entire populace. They were actually designed to anesthetize you and to prepare you for work while giving you lessons that actually punished you if you challenged the orthodoxy and the order and compliance of the place that you were in. Right? So now if we think about operating under these particular understandings, abolition says there's been something happening, but we haven't paid attention to it. When we pay attention to it, it instantaneously becomes a threat. And this is why abolition is asking some very different questions. And remember, the abolition is the ending of the practices that support marginalization, isolation, criminalization, and other forms of dehumanization. It is the practice that ends those things, but also is seeking to end the rationale for those things to happen. So there's a double-sided coin to this. So it's not just the end of the practice, but it's also the end of the rationale that says that these practices should be occurring. So now when we think about this in relationship to schools, we got some very difficult questions to ask ourselves, and ones that people often run from, but again, are right in front of our face. So when we talk about what abolition practices look like in current K-12 schools, one of the things that we see is an interesting moment if we look at states like California, where they have actually suspended the use of high-stakes standardized testing for college admissions. So the state of California has actually suspended the ACT and SAT as a requirement for college admissions. Now, put this out in the world, we understand no young person has died because they didn't take a standardized test. We also know that according to psychometricians who write standardized tests, the best thing a standardized test can tell us is how well a young person takes a test at a particular time of the day, right? That's about it. But we still use these spaces as gatekeepers for college admissions. So as an abolition practice, what would it mean to eliminate standardized high stakes testing? We already have a moment where people are doing into college admissions, supposedly in response to COVID, but we also know that they've never really been needed. What they have done over the years is kept this gate for folks to not be able to attain access to college. So that's one thing that's already in play that we can now think about expanding. Another thing, what would it mean to engage in curricular practices that were intentionally connected to the lives of our students? Now, we got a historical example of this. Vanessa Siddle Walker wrote a very important book called The Lost Education of Horace Tate. And what she's talking about in that book, and this is Black teachers in the 1950s who were exchanging curriculum with each other, also with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, telling them what's really needed in terms of getting viable education for Black youth, right? So they're actually exchanging curriculum, talking with each other, telling the NAACP that, look, the goal here is not to sit next to white kids. The goal here is to get access to the funds that have been disinvested from our space. So now these particular practices are ones that we actually have in our wheelhouse. The issue is, to what extent will we engage them? And this is always important, because now we have to confront things like white supremacy in education. And white supremacy, and I'm being very clear here, I'm not talking about white supremacist terror, the events of January 6th. When I say white supremacy, I am specifically speaking to the assumed views and values of white Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual Christian males as normal, right, and good. And in the history of the United States, the majority of curriculum in K-12 public schools have been reflective of the views and values of that populace I just mentioned. Everything else has been othered. It has been made strange. It has been removed. So now a practice of abolition says to young people who are in these experiences, what does it mean to recoup what has been held from you? Or as my good friend Patrick Kamayan says, what does it mean to claim back what has been stolen? And now, what does a curriculum look like that is returning folks to ask these questions around what has been stolen? Now, let me be clear about this. As soon as I say this, I know some folks on the call are probably a little testy about my language, but let me be clear. It's not around holding animosity, but it's literally around asking a deeper question around, why would it be advantageous to keep these things from you, right? So if I can actually create a system that is based on getting you into a docile state of submission, what would it mean to break the orthodoxy of that? What does it mean to reclaim who you are and what it is that you're trying to do? How is it connected to a long history of people who have done the same thing? Because a lot of times what curriculum can do is fool you into believing that these things have never happened. So now, as a practice of abolition, we go back and say, not only have they happened, but teaching in a particular way is centered around your submission. Now, people may think about that as threatening. I don't. I think about that as shifting the course of what it is that we've been doing in those schools that are on the margins. I think about that in a city like Chicago, where we have 100+ schools that to this day do not have libraries. I think about that in a city where many of the schooling stock, the school stock, building stock on the South and West sides are in buildings that are between 70 and 100 years old with bad ventilation systems. And the young people who are attending those places are going home to multi-generational families We know that the science tells us about the spread of COVID, that one of the ways to spread it very quickly is to have a bad ventilation system. So now, when we ask these structural questions and what can be done to alleviate this, some of those answers are right in front of our face, and I'll leave you all with this. Many of you all are familiar in 2013 when 49 schools were closed here in Chicago. Something else happened right after those closures. So between 2013 and 2015, 1,000 teachers actually lost their employment in Chicago public schools. At the same time, 1,000 police officers were hired in that same time frame. So now, when we ask the question, where is the priority? The city of Chicago has been very clear. And what we've also seen when we look at spaces, school spaces, that police officers do not make young people feel safe. The things that young people talk about that make them feel safe is the presence of a caring adult and the presence of curriculum that is connected to their lives and teachers that are willing to engage them. Now, we have schools in Chicago that do this, but we also have schools in Chicago where it makes it next to impossible to engage this. So our practice of abolition is calling this into question and now creating strategies to build something new, because we are clear that reform is not enough. And in too many instances, we have been asked to reform that which has not worked. So now, what does it mean to engage a politic of abolition where we are saying the only space that we are willing to engage is one where we are building something different, right? And I have to be very honest about that in terms of some people find that unsettling. It is exactly the point, because we have settled for the things that have dehumanized, maimed, and isolated us. Now you're seeing young folks make this claim that something different is the imperative. It will not move forward without a commitment to do something different. So let me stop there, because I'm we're much more interested in engaging you all's questions, but thank you all for having us, and I hope my comments were making sense.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stovall, and thank you, Dr. Nguyen. So many powerful statements and thoughts, and I have a couple of questions that have come at me, but I encourage our audience to continue to put questions in the chat. So let me start with, this comment came during Dr. Nguyen's comments, in the context of the harm done by police in schools, but also the desire for local control. Who should mandate police officers out of schools? The federal government, state government, city, Board of Education, so on.
Yeah, I think just as a general approach, I'm always wary of turning to the state to solve our problems for us, and that communities ourselves have to do this work. So we can't always make appeals to the state. So I think while legislation can be helpful, unless folks buy into the idea that police do not make us safer, that police make us unsafe, without that sort of rooted in community, legislation can pass all we want, and we'll just find other carceral solutions. So for me, it's like, we can't appeal to the state because the state has set up policing to kill people. And so we need to kind of do the work ourselves. And that's sort of what the lesson from the Black Panthers is, right? Is that communities need to do this organizing for ourselves. We need to, to Dave's point, we need to create the alternative schools that we want, right? We have to build something else that we want, and not just continually capitulate to the state and request the state to be more humane towards us, right? And so I think that this has to be a community-driven tactic. Now, that's not to say that state legislation isn't useful on the way towards abolition, but that we can't rely on the state to do the work for us, because the state is invested in dehumanizing folks.
Would you also say it's really starting with your direct local community and then sort of spreading that way? Or how are you defining community? Let me ask that question differently.
Yeah, local school councils, neighborhoods, block by block. Like, this is the deep, Ella Baker calls it spade work, right? This is like the deep rooted work we have to do in order to build a different kind of world. And we can't kind of just tinker around the edges and say, we just don't want police. It has to actually be a wholesale rethinking of what schooling is and what school safety looks like. And it's not something the state defines for us. It's something we as communities, local communities, have to decide for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that's come in, besides the obvious defunding of campus police, how can university campuses live up to the ideal of life-affirming institutions?
I think one of the things is really recognizing what universities are structured intentionally to do, right? So this idea, the ivory tower is not this kind of far off concept, right? Universities are structured in many ways to keep folks out. So now, one of the things in terms of rethinking this was, well, what does it mean to bring folks in? And secondly, what are you bringing folks into? Right? So now if we think about what does it mean to expand the reach of the university, where are the spaces that the university has not gone, right? So if we think about locally here in Chicago, what does it mean to have connections to spaces on the South and West sides that are experiencing multiple forms of disinvestment, gentrification, change, and now what type of work is done in those spaces? And second, and the third point is really being able to suspend one's expertise, right? So universities kind of had this strange thing where you got a bunch of people with a bunch of letters behind their name, and then the false notion of them being experts, right? And that's a ruse, right? So this thing around what you can do is shift your expertise to now understanding that you are not an expert, but two, that the only way to engage in change is to start with the issues and concerns that people have expressed in those localized communities that Dr. Nguyen has mentioned. So now it's really around what services, what resources can be utilized in those spaces according to the needs of the people in those spaces. Not some slick sounding research project, not something that's gonna give you a ton of NIH dough, but this thing around really being intentional around centering community need first, and now the utilization of those resources to address those needs.
And I think to build on Dave's point, that we also have to recognize how much the university creates the research to justify policing in the United States, right? So the coming super predator, right? The spectacle of the coming super predator is based on academic research, right? Eugenics is based on academic research. So we have to understand the university as a site for this racist knowledge production that sustains policing functions. And so part of it is also not just about getting slick NIH dough, right? It's also about actually ending the kind of research that sustains, like holding people accountable for the racist research they produce and the material effects of that research on people, right? Like it participates in death dealing across Chicago, across the country.
It's complicated because there's multiple layers of just, so who's sort of having oversight over that and looking at that and calling colleagues out, which I imagine as faculty is not always the easiest conversation to perhaps have. Another question, what does the resolution of a violent incident on campus look like for all parties involved when there is no one present to enforce the law?
It's an important question, and it's an important question in a number of different ways. And I think it's one that has often been placed to the abolition community, but I also think it's a question around thinking about what are the ways that are available, that are in our disposal to address violence, right? And this thing around violence is best addressed with preemptive strategies, not post the event, right? And I think this becomes really important because now when someone is revealing that they're having these particular feelings, it's not about criminalizing them, but it's really around addressing those spaces. So when people talk about a restorative or transformative justice, What we're talking about is a set of instances that allow us to do things so that the events don't occur. Now, I don't want to run from the question. So when those events do occur, I think it's important to have those strategies in place to do a couple of things. One, to address the harm according to the person who has experienced it. And then second, to be clear around what are the strategies that are put in place to prevent future harm. And this is a broader, this goes to a broader policy issue, but it also goes to this space around not criminalizing folks largely before something occurs, right? So UIC has this notorious practice of printing out these crime reports, right? And I talk about this in my classes and in other spaces, right? So the UIC crime report is always Black male, 5'3" to 6'8", 130 to 350 pounds. So who is that, right? That's every Black body that shows up on campus, right? So this thing around what does it mean to interrupt those particular practices. So we are preventative in our strategies, but we also need those things that are able to address when an event occurs, especially around violence, because now when the violent event is one thing, but what Ruth Wilson Gilmore often reminds us is that a transformative strategy says, how do we get to this event? How did we come to this moment? And now what are we willing to do now that we are here?
Thank you. This is going back a little bit to the previous question. The follow-up question is, how can we hold researchers accountable for their racial bias in their work?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult one just based on how academics are rewarded and funded for their research, right? So there's a lot of money for national security, for public safety. And so people are willing to that's provided by the federal government, right? So people are willing to kind of bend their politics and apply for research grants that are about criminalizing people. And so I think if we change the ways that we fund and reward academic research, the way that promotion and tenure functions to support, to make people chase tainted money, essentially, I think is important. We have an institutional review board that doesn't necessarily consider, hey, this is a research project that's based on the premise that Somali youth are future terrorists and we need interventions, right? So, I think the layers that are at play in universities are not enough. And that we actually reward people who are doing the most harmful work because it's what gets citations, it's what gets funded. And so we actually have to change what's valued by the university to say that this is not valued by the university. This is research that does harm. But that's, changing a lot of the structures around university funding, promotion and tenure structures, oversight. And I know this is possible because I know how radical scholars get attacked all of the time and get held accountable and get stripped of resources, of time. I mean, Cornell West, right? So we know that there's ways of ensuring that there's oversight. It's just never been applied really to people who are doing racist work or harmful work, right? It's always been applied to radical folks who are trying to challenge the status quo.
Thank you for that. Another question, what can be done to shift the focus of CVE away from blatantly criminalizing disaffected young folks and towards bringing them into efforts to create schools and other sites committed to serving youth that are actually supporting all young people?
Well, there's a very quick solution to this, right? I mean, one is to end CVE as a program in and of itself, right? And then to shift its focus to white terrorist nationalism, right? So that thing around, so if the United States is concerned around violent extremism, they need to interrogate itself, right? So this thing around now, when you are talking about this, we have to change the scope, right? Because according to this, and it's kind of this random thing, and Nicole does work on this, it's kind of this random thing. according to the FBI, the most dangerous domestic threat is a bunch of disaffected white dudes. But we don't have this conversation in our broader scope, right? So and the FBI is clear about that. They've produced numerous reports on this, but yet where is the will to interrogate that grouping of people, right? And then really, and even then, not necessarily criminalizing them, but understanding the source of their disaffection, right? So really thinking about that in real time.
I also think, like, if Somali youth are disaffected, is it because there's something pathologically wrong with them, or is it because they're experiencing anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, right? Like anti-immigrant racism. And so I think we have to be more thoughtful about what is actually doing harm to young people. It's not actually that young people are sites of harm. They are living through harm and violence, and their expressions of disaffection are a result of that. So it's not about like fixing individual kids, right? It's actually about altering the conditions in which young people live that will create healthy communities. So part of the issue is the way that we talk about violence and political violence now is that everything is an individual problem. White supremacy is like there's these few bad white guys who are committing acts of violence. We don't have to think about white supremacy as something institutional and structural. We can just point to like the people from January 6th and say, those are white supremacists. There's nothing else. We just have to arrest those folks and the problem is solved, right? And that just absolves the role of the US government in maintaining white supremacy, the role everyday people play in maintaining white supremacy, the way it's built into our structures and our institutions. So we actually they're deeper questions. And if we just focus on individual people, the symptoms of these harmful structures and systems, then we're just like, only getting after the most extreme forms of white supremacy, and we're doing nothing to get at the roots of what's creating those extreme examples.
Because it's easier, because it's easier to have that conversation, to point to your point, your example about January 6th, than really getting to the root of looking at what's happening, and especially with the CVE program. So just as a quick follow-up question, so that's on a federal level, is eliminating that program. And Dr. Stovall, when you said this, my thought when Dr. Wynn was talking about it was, if I think of active shooters, it is white males. I mean, that's in most recent history in my mind, it was what popped into my mind. So as you're describing the program, what a dichotomy.
Exactly. I mean, to this day, many of the folk on the call remember Columbine, right? So Columbine in 1999 occurred, and to this day, and it's a point I always use in class, to this day, Columbine does not have metal detectors, but Columbine does have a staff of over 35 counselors. Let's just keep it just succinct to that particular conversation, it lets us know where the priorities are.
And there's never been a Columbine style shooting in a school serving kids of color, right? But this is where we see the using Columbine to justify the installation of metal detectors and police officers in city schools.
Yeah. Another question. What should the collaboration between professors, academics, public educators, parents, and students look like to get police-free schools and end policing cultures in schools?
Well, we actually see some of this happening now, right? So the broader survey around police in schools, because the idea, and I think this is the thing to push back on entities like the city of Chicago or Chicago Public Schools, is really putting out there that young folks who are talking about what makes them feel safe, and in most instances, the answer is not police, right? And that, I think that's a critically important juncture to bring out, because the assumption is that schools want police, and it's different. Adults in school want police. Young folks do not. And I think it's important to put that dichotomy into our broader conversation. So academics can definitely assist in that space in terms of what does it mean in those spaces that have taken police out, right? Because there's a number of high schools that have removed police. And then now, what are they doing to engage in transformative strategies around encouraging a sense of well-being in those buildings?
I think I have time for one last question, although I think there's lots of questions I'd like to continue this conversation with. And maybe as a wrap up, what have you seen that you would consider to be successes that have been in the fight for social justice in schools? Have there been, maybe I'll say. I'm now paraphrasing somebody else's question though.
Nicole, you want to go, or you want?
No, go for it, Dave.
Like, one of the things that I think has been a start is this idea of thinking about ethnic studies curriculum and ethnic studies across all content area. So it's not just, so it's really the acknowledging of what has been removed historically from K-12 schools, and now what has been the attempt to bring it back, but now to talk about it across subject area in places where we don't even know that it's been excluded. So give you all a quick example. Very few people know that the person responsible for creating GIS, which is the Geographic Integrated Systems that everybody has on their phone, is a Black woman, right? And now when we start to engage that, not just as this trivial point, but to say, if we look at her story, now, what are all the barriers that were put in front of her? And now how do we see those barriers now some 50 years later? And now what do we do to address those issues? And can we do that through something like curriculum?
Thank you. Dr. Nguyen, any final thoughts?
I think that's a great way to end.
Perfect. Well, thank you both so very much for this important conversation and discussion, and hopefully it has, opened additional thoughts and conversations about what people can do within their own communities and just as we move forward together. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your talent and knowledge. Let me just wrap up really quickly and invite all of you to join us next week on Wednesday, March 17th at noon Central Standard Time for our next alumni exchange event, when we'll be joined by a UIC faculty member who will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on Chicago's public transportation system and the connection between the city and the suburbs as we present what's down the line public transportation in a post-pandemic Chicago. To find a recording of this episode and all of our past episodes, please go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, be on the lookout for that quick survey that I mentioned at the beginning. We appreciate and value your opinions. Thank you again to Drs. Nguyen and Dr. Stovall again for this wonderful conversation and for sharing all of your knowledge and discussion with us today. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future alumni exchange program. Have a great day.
Thank you all again.
Thank you.